Hey Jiz, we're going to continue learning from Ma'am Loaz, the Book of Esther, in preparation for March 13th and the 13th of Adar for the fast of Esther. We're going to try to understand what they did there during Purim and why, and how it's at all relevant and useful for us in our time, which is 5,785, which are the end of times. So basically, we're told in the Torah a few things that I find very interesting. One is that in a lot of places it says, for the last generation, write this down for the last generation, or just so the end generation, Dor Acharon, they will know and they will understand and they will do. And that all of the history of the nation of Israel, which is in the Torah, that it's for us to learn from, and the information about the time and how significant time is. Time is one of the dimensions of our reality. And I've gone over this in many, many different videos, especially since Defending the Traditions video and onwards, where I'm looking at consciousness. I'm trying to understand what we're learning in the Torah and the times and our times and what's going on around us, the increase in anti-Semitism, October 7th, all the things that are happening. What's the message? And also Ezra, the book of Ezra, after Purim, in the middle of our story, where they also had knowledge. Mordecai had knowledge of what was happening around him. And he was able to motivate and gather all of the Jews to fast for Esther, for Queen Esther. And as a result, they got the redemption, basically a little mini redemption. They came back to the land of Israel. They built the second temple. And when they built the second temple, Ezra and Nehemiah, they read the Torah and they made sure that everybody understood it. Meaning after only 70 years in exile, things had changed. Okay, reality, like we said, is 5-dimensional. 3 are physical, 1 is spiritual, 1 is time. I go over this in a lot of my different videos, so we're just moving on here now. And there's some way that they are connected. So after the temple was destroyed and there was no longer sacrifices that were keeping our spiritual level high, after that happened, time changed. And that's when they set our calendar until the end of time. So before that, when they had the temple, they didn't have to set the calendar. We have to now look and say, when is Pesach 2025? Because we need to know the date so we can plan around that. But back then, it was real time. Time is dependent on the other factors here. So Ezra made sure that everyone understood that. They also set the calendar for us going forward. So we are now here, 5,785, the end of time. We have the prophecies, but we're also specifically continuing to do the holidays like Purim and like the other important festivals like Pesach, which comes after Purim. So again, we're continuing on from all the information that we've learned up until now, in the hopes that by March 13th, we all understand. Okay, and like I said, Ezra made sure that the people there understood what they were saying in the Torah. They translated it to Aramaic. And just like Rav Yaakov Kuli, in his introduction to Ma'am Loaz, in the first book in Bereshit, in Genesis, he explains there in his introduction why he found it so important that they do this project so that we, especially going forwards from his time, forwards towards the end of time, that all the Jews would understand what's written in the Torah. Okay, we can continue to learn the Torah week after week after week, year after year after year, and not see any relevance for us in our lives. Or we can understand what they're saying to us, what we need to understand from the wisdom of God, the creator of the reality, because the reality was created with wisdom. We need to be wise with understanding and understand with wisdom. If we take out the wisdom from how we're looking at reality, we are no longer wise. Okay, and I did a video called Foolish and Unwise Nation. We become a goy naval, chas v'shalom. But that's also in the Torah, the warning in Ha'azinu. Not to become a goy naval, to continue to understand the wisdom so that we can navigate the reality properly. What did they do there in Purim? Why was Purim different than the Holocaust? I'll post the links to my video from last year from Rabbi Avigdor Miller, who explains to us what the difference there was. Now, what we want at the end of time, what the Jews have always wanted, is to come back into the land to build the third temple to get the redemption. And so that's what they got there in Purim, basically. And that's what we want. So we need to do what they did. So in order to understand what happened there and understand perhaps what's happening now in our times with a little bit more understanding and wisdom, we learn. And we learn from Ma'am Lo'az because this is the fastest and best way to learn because it includes all of the information. So we continue in 113. The king spoke to his wise men who knew the times, for it was the king's custom to place such matters before all who knew law and justice. Ahasuerus sought the advice of Jewish sages and asked them to judge Vashti. He especially sought out sages from the tribe of Issachar, who had understanding of the times. That's in Chronicles 12:33. They had an understanding of the time. Time is one of the 5 dimensions of the reality. No matter how difficult was the question put to them, they could answer it without delay. When judging a case, they knew how to adjust the penalty to the time. They were the sages who knew how to calculate the phases of the moon and the planets, and thus construct the calendar. So I guess here also we have space. And that's why when I'm not going to go into that, but space, this is the sun, this is the moon, these are the stars, this is the planets, this is the zodiac. They had knowledge of, how to adjust the time according to this and the penalty. So the king realized that only such great sages would be able to judge such a major case as that of Vashti. Although the king usually judged capital cases by himself, he did not consider it proper in this case because he was an interested party. Furthermore, he was afraid to sit in judgment while in such a rage. Now, again, I was talking about this the other day with my husband about when we listen to information, let's say, when information is presented to us, and this is something that the rabbis always say, that I've listened to, they always say, listen like a judge and not like a lawyer. Meaning, don't defend your current ideology. Don't defend your current belief when presented with new information. Try to listen like a judge and not like a lawyer, meaning don't defend what you already think you know. Rather, listen like a judge who is impartial. Make judgments according to the information presented based on where that information is coming from. I've done several different videos regarding information control, which now in our reality, we hopefully could see, especially with COVID, for example, okay, that about the information control. So we have to be very careful where we get our information, and we have to be wise to know, as we saw in the previous chapter in the Book of Esther, that there are people always plotting to bring about the downfall of the Jews. Well, why is everyone so obsessed with the Jews all the time? We have to try to understand with some wisdom, because the world was created with wisdom. So here, Ahasuerus wanted the Jewish sages to sit in judgment of this case about what to do with Vashti, who snubbed his request. So he recused himself anyway because he was in a rage. And he says here that if he sentenced her to death and the sentence was carried out, it would be too late for him to change his mind. The Jewish sages could judge the case objectively on the basis of legal precedent. So we always have to also keep that in mind for ourselves, that there has to be some sort of basis to our belief system. We can't just say, we never learned, for example, about when Zionism started, the whole ideology and all of the information. We didn't go and learn that. I know I didn't. I never learned all about that. So how did I base my belief on the fact that I thought that the state and having the IDF is the only thing that's protecting us from another Holocaust? Where did I get that information from? And what do I do when I see that my whole entire belief was proved incorrect? Do I now continue to believe that? Do I continue to defend that? Or do I go back and look at all of the information and try to understand that with wisdom and be wise with understanding? So that's what I've done, Baruch Hashem, and that's what I'm suggesting that everyone do. Suspend your current belief system, take another look, go back and look at the information, and let's learn. So when the case was handed to the Jewish sages, they did not know what to reply. If they found Vashti innocent, the king might take it as a slight. Here Vashti had displayed gross disrespect to him, but the Jewish sages did not consider it a capital offense. He might even sentence them to death. Besides, they wanted to punish her for forcing Jewish girls to violate the Sabbath and for trying to prevent the rebuilding of the temple. So again, we need to understand that there are very powerful entities in our reality that do not want the temple to be rebuilt. They do everything to separate the Jews. And we've defined what it means to be a Jew, because here in the story of Purim is when this word, Yehudi, Mordechai HaYehudi, that's when we first encounter it. So we went back in a video called Jewish Identity Crisis to define this. And we see that there are many, many things happening in our reality that want to separate us from God and from the Torah, especially the Torah laws, which again, the state of Israel, which is one of the 19 centers for the WEF's Fourth Industrial Revolution of the New World Order Agenda 2030, that's the state of Israel. It's one of the 19 centers. So we see that even Bibi Netanyahu says that the state of Israel is never going to have the laws of the Torah, which is literally exactly what we want, the Jews. The Jews want that. We want that here in the Holy Land. That's what we want. So there's always something like we saw in the last two chapters ago in the Book of Esther, where it said that Vashti wanted the girls, she always took the Jewish girls and made them violate the Sabbath, Shabbat. Ot hi leolam. This is a connection. This is a spiritual day. I have another video called The Importance of Shabbat, or Divine Time, to separate us from God. This is the protection. This is what's been keeping the nation of Israel alive over time, is the connection. We didn't always have a state, and we didn't always have an IDF. And even on the date that we did have that, it didn't help us. So we need to try to, again, understand with wisdom and be wise with understanding. Do not be a goy naval with no wisdom and no understanding, says God in Ha'azinu, says Moshe Rabbeinu in Ha'azinu, in the Torah. So, I mean, even a lot of all the other nations, the 70 nations, do you think they would do the hostage deals the way the state of Israel is doing it? Does that not put us in more danger? Is that being wise with even just any understanding of what's going to happen? because it already happened. When they did hostage deals, they got Sinwar for whatever. And that was one of the architects of October 7th. So what do we think going forwards is going to happen by releasing thousands of terrorists? So even the 70 nations, like I said, they have these great ideas. But when it really comes down to it, do you think that they would do the same things? Or do the Jews, when we abandon the laws of the Torah and we go after their laws and we do what they think is a good idea, we become a goy naval. I'm getting off the topic too much. So again, separating us from Shabbat, which is our advantage. It helps speed the redemption. If all the Jews kept Shabbat, it would speed the redemption, which would be a good thing. That's what we want. So he might even sentence them, the Jews, to death. Besides, they wanted to punish her for forcing Jewish girls to violate the Sabbath and for trying to prevent the rebuilding of the temple. It would be very hard for them to find her innocent. On the other hand, if they judged that she should be killed, the king might feel sorry for her later and take revenge on them. Worse still, he might pardon her, and she would end up as their confirmed enemy. Although the king was now furious at her, his love could easily overcome his anger in time. They decided to give the king the following answer. As long as we lived in peace in our own land, our minds were clear and calm. We also had the Urim and Tumim, which would provide a divine answer to any question. The laws that we are going to be judged as Jews are the laws of the Torah. So when we were in the land with the temple and we had a high spiritual level, we could judge things more properly and more clearly, especially with the Urim and Tumim. But since we went out into exile, and even for them, which was only 70 years, they said their minds were not clear enough to have that good judgment. And they didn't have the Urim and Tumim. How much more so? Are our minds even clear at this point? So they decided to give the king the following answer. As long as we lived in peace in our own land, our minds were clear and calm. We also had the Urim and Tumim, which would provide a divine answer to any question. But now our temple has been destroyed. We have been in exile to Babylon, and we have suffered very much. We no longer have the Urim and Tumim, and our minds are no longer clear. We are therefore unfit to judge a capital case. If we find that the queen deserves a death penalty, we might be sentencing an innocent person to death. If we find her innocent, we shall be accomplices in her disrespect for the king. We therefore cannot render a decision in such an important case. Our suggestion is that you present the case before the wise men of Ammon and Moab who live in your capital. They are expert judges, and you can be sure that they will hand down a fair verdict. They have lived in peace for many years and have not been exiled as we have. They are like old wine, which is very clear because its lees has settled. They are the ones to whom you should go with this most important case. The Jewish scholars had another motive. Although they did not mention it openly, Ahasuerus clearly had fallen into this quandary because of wine. Ammon and Moab had come into existence through wine. Lot had been plied with wine and had slept with his daughters, fathering Ammon and Moab in Genesis 19:30-38. They would therefore be best suited to judge an accusation that involved wine and drunkenness. Do you understand how all of the information in the Torah, it's like all building on one thing after another? Like, we have to have a very broad and deep understanding of the entire Torah and the entire history in order to really understand what's going on. See, that's why everything is always like, this is from Chronicles, this is from Genesis. We have to base our information on something, and that's the wisdom of the Torah. It's not all laid out there very plainly for us to see. We have to go and try to understand it. And that's why smarter people in previous generations, like the Gaon from Vilna, like everyone before us who are at a higher spiritual level, explained it to us in their books. And right now in history, we have the most information available to us. We have all of their books. We can go and learn it and try to understand. And like I said, we have the anthology that Rav Yaakov Kuli compiled for us. 114. Those close to him were Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memuchan, 7 princes of Persia and Media who had direct access to the king and who sat first in the kingdom. After the Jewish sages disqualified themselves from the case, the king turned to the 7 princes of Persia and Media who were closest to him. These men represented the various parts of his kingdom. Karshina was from Africa and was in charge of the royal stables and livestock. Shethar was from India and was in charge of the royal wine cellars. Admatha was from Western Europe and was in charge of the royal fields and gardens. He also served as chief justice. Tarshish was from Egypt and was in charge of the royal household. Meres, Marsena, and Memuchan were from Jerusalem. And since they understood everything, they were placed in charge of the others. They were also in charge of the king's appointments. There are other opinions regarding the nationalities of these advisors. Some authorities maintained that they were actually Jews. Others held that they were Gentiles. There is an opinion that they were from Ammon and Moab. The king had taken the advice of the Jewish sages and had presented the case to these men who were among his closest advisors. Each of these advisors presided on a different day of the week. Since it was now Saturday, the 7th day, it was Memuchan's turn, and therefore, as we shall see, he spoke first. Memuchan also spoke first because he was the least of the king's advisors. It was a custom to allow the most junior member to speak first so that he would not feel compelled to go along with his superiors. According to the opinion that these were Jewish advisors, Memuchan was none other than the prophet Daniel. The Persian government had passed a law prohibiting prayer to any god for a 30-day period, and when Daniel violated it by praying to God, he was cast into the lion's den. Daniel 6. Again, we need to know who all these people are and what their stories are. Since he was willing to risk his life for God, he was worthy of miracles and was saved. After this event, Daniel was given the name Memuchan, which literally means prepared. He was prepared to suffer martyrdom and prepared to experience miracles. Providence had decreed that Vashti be judged by Daniel. Although the other Jewish sages had disqualified themselves, Daniel had faith that God would not let any harm come to him. Just as God had delivered him previously, so he would be protected now. Daniel also suffered from a Persian wife that Belshazzar had given him. She was wealthier than he and lorded it over him, forcing him to speak Persian. Now that Daniel was judging Vashti, he would have an opportunity to rectify his personal situation. 122. Coming up. Daniel was a holy prophet who obviously would not marry a Persian Gentile. Because Belshazzar had made the match, he had no choice but to marry the woman. But first he had converted her to Judaism. As mentioned earlier, there was another opinion that these advisors were Gentiles. According to this opinion, Memuchan was actually Haman. He was given the nickname Memuchan because he was prepared, Memuchan, to cause trouble. The first trouble that he caused was Vashti's death sentence. Haman bore a grudge against Vashti because she went out of her way to snub him. When Vashti invited all the ladies of Shushan to her feast, she had neglected Haman's wife. Haman had a daughter, and he hoped that with Vashti out of the way, his daughter would be a major candidate for queen. 115. Kedat ma la'asot bel malka Vashti al asher lo asta et ma'amar hamelech Achashverosh beyad ha-sarisim. According to the law, what must be done with Queen Vashti, who did not obey the king's order through his ministers? According to the law, what must be done with Vashti, who did not obey the king's orders through his ministers? The king asked his 7 ministers to advise him as to the penalty for the queen who disobeys the king. Since he loved her, he did not want them to hand down a death sentence. She had shown him gross disrespect, so he could not openly forgive her on his own. To do so would demonstrate that he was a king that could not defend his own honor. But if his chief advisors advocated clemency, he would not demean himself by accepting their advice. The king gave his advisors subtle hints that he desired clemency. He reminded them that he wanted to know what to do to Queen Vashti. Judge her as a queen and not as a commoner. Remember that I made an improper demand when I asked her to appear naked before the entire company. Furthermore, I did not give the order personally, but only through my ministers. The order was given impetuously, without thought, and the queen knew that I was drunk. She might deserve some punishment, but not death. Let her remain queen even after she is punished. Do not be too quick to judge my wife. I know that the law clearly prescribes a death penalty for such a case. But if you study the precedents closely enough, you might find some way to judge her leniently. Perhaps an exception can be made because she is my wife. The law demanded absolute obedience to the king, might be somewhat more lenient in the case of his wife, with whom he is so familiar. If I could pardon her on my own, I would. But as you know, the situation makes that course of action impossible. You are independent judges. I can suggest, but I cannot give you orders. The queen's life is in your hands. We'll continue next time with chapter 3, 116.